Thanks so much, Jocelyn. Good afternoon, everyone, or for some of you, it may be morning. And we've got some international folks joining us today, which is amazing. Thank you for making the time out of your day to join us. And just before we get into things, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional unceded territories that I'm situated on today, which is that of the Coast Salish people here in Vancouver, British Columbia, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam. And I think given today's topic around anti-racism, there's obviously a lot of importance to understanding the history of where we're each situated. So if we could each take a moment to share that in the chat box, or just for ourselves, take that moment to acknowledge. And before we give everyone an opportunity, there's a good number of folks, and while this is a virtual community of practice, we also want people to have an opportunity to just have a quick chance to get to know one or two others on the call. I also, as a part of an introduction of myself, wanted to also talk a bit about acknowledging my own ancestry and the motherland of my ancestors. And so for myself, I'm Canadian born and raised and have lived here the majority of my life. In terms of my ancestry, my parents both come from South Korea, and in the middle of the shared photo, shared slide, is a picture of my now passed maternal grandmother, who spent her entire life living in Suwon, South Korea. And the photo on the far right is a picture of the home where my grandmother lived the majority of her life, where my aunts continue to live. And there beneath the pine tree, you see the gravesite of my maternal grandmother. And some of this may come out in our conversation today about our connection to our ancestors and to land, which is very much a part of an Indigenous perspective and paying respect to people. And we'll see how that weaves into our work in terms of partnership brokering. So hopefully a good number of you had a chance just to get to know at least one other person in brief, and we acknowledge that this doesn't make up for actually getting to know someone more fully. We'll get into, before we introduce the folks that I really want to give a platform to in terms of sharing their own experience as partnership brokers in relation to anti-racism, I want to provide some context. So
David, I'm sorry to interrupt. We've got about 5 more people to come back. Sorry about that. Apologies.
No problem. So just allowing a bit more time for everyone to join back, and hopefully we've got everyone back now. So yeah, just before we go to the folks that we want to hear from, who will be sharing their direct experience as partnership brokers around looking at things from an anti-racism lens, what I'd like to do is provide some context. And this set of slides will be provided to everyone following the presentation. So not to worry in terms of capturing the key points. And I know there's a lot of extra detail here, but in terms of the Partnership Brokers Association, it was really prompted by one of the most shocking events from last year, which was the killing of George Floyd in the US by a police officer. And of course, this only highlighted some of the pre-existing conditions around racism that existed in American society, but also really broadened the conversation worldwide. And from that triggering event, at a PBA Associates call, we asked the question, well, what can the PBA do in relation to anti-racism, and really daylighting that within the work that the
David, you got muted.
Yes, you're muted somehow.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There, yep, perfect. That's
Okay,
great. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So in terms of what the PBA could do, which resulted in a series of sessions, and then ultimately in November, December, a cohort of PBA associates and alumni spending 5 sessions together to really start to unpack what anti-racism, how anti-racism could be integrated into the work that we do as partnership brokers. And so again, this slide will be provided to you after the fact. This is a real beautiful illustration that Jocelyn, you just highlighted to me a couple of weeks ago, that was resulting from the conversation that happened at the PBA Associates Gathering back in October, which highlights some of the key things around key points raised in the conversation back in October. And really about the fact that this is a learning journey that is not just about our professional work, but it's about our personal relationship to race and our personal positioning around anti-racism and how we embed that into the way we live our lives. And so stemming from the PBA Associates Gathering, from the work of the PBA Associates and alumni coming together in a cohort, we developed an overall guide, and this is meant to be very much a guide to help us in terms of individuals who are practitioners explore anti-racism further and apply it to ourselves and our work, as opposed to the definitive set of questions around looking at what does this mean for me on a personal basis? What does this mean as I'm thinking about how I apply it to my work in partnership brokering? And what are the specific things for me to think about when I'm applying it to specific upcoming conversations or sessions that I might be convening as a partnership broker or supporting as a partnership broker? And the key theme that came about was the idea of braiding. And if any of you have recently come across a publication that came out, I think in 2019, called Towards Braiding, it really talks about the fact that the importance of moving away from strictly colonial patriarchal frameworks to something that really looks at indigenous perspectives, and the fact that with braiding, looking at both as a literal activity, but also as a metaphor, the fact that it's about interweaving different perspectives. And we think about the PBA promoting core principles such as diversity of perspective and interweaving those for the creation of something new. So that became an underlying theme to these questions. So now, before we get into the question set, what I'd like to do is provide an opportunity for Yeshe, Peni, and Gillian to introduce yourselves as people that will be having a conversation with around sharing your direct experience around anti-racism. So I'll first turn it over to Yeshe.
And just to make sure she's unmuted. Good.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. My name's Yeshe, as David said. I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Aboriginal people. So I've made some contributions to the question set that we'll be working through today. The reason that I've been thinking about this and working on this kind of work is I've spent 20 years working largely in international development. I'm a trainer and broker with the Partnership Brokers Association. So a lot of my brokering and training work is in multiracial spaces. And I've probably spent the last 5 years focusing really intensively on addressing race in both training and brokering work. I also have biracial children that the world identifies as Black, and they identify as Black, and have also spent the last 5 years working really intensively on understanding the systemic racism that they face in Australia and how to work that through with them and support them on that as well. So I've had both a very intensive professional and personal kind of learning journey around working explicitly with race in the last 5 to 7 years. I think it's really important that that I'm clear that my contributions are derived from experience working in multiracial spaces, largely in the Pacific, and in Southeast Asia and South Asia to some degree as well. So I'm not sure, and I work really closely with Peni. He's a very close colleague of mine who will speak just after me, and we're kind of on this learning journey together, pushing each other and educating each other about our different experiences. And I hope our experience will be applicable and useful to all of you, but I want to be really clear about the context that I've derived that experience from, because, you know, none of our contexts are universal. So
Thank you so much, Yeshe. And we're really excited to have you. I think it's important to note that in terms of the questions, it's really the core of it is from the work that Yeshe and Peni, who we'll hear from next, provided as a real great starting point. So Peni, over to you.
Thank you, David. Good morning from the Pacific, but afternoon, obviously, we're all at. My name is Peni. I'm an indigenous Fijian. And I've lived and worked in Fiji, but worked also internationally and regionally. I think I've grown up with a really keen understanding of the challenges that indigenous people face. And, you know, so one of my, I think, personal and professional challenges has always been, you know, how do we use our privilege, you know, as in, you know, how do privileged indigenous people use our privilege to amplify the agency and voice of Pacific Islanders? You know, so Yeshe and I work in the space of partnership brokering. I've been using the approach, I think, for close to a decade, but been an accredited broker for, I think, a year or so. As an internal broker, my role is to support the organization I work with, to develop and maintain partnerships with educational institutions, or TVET, vocational training institutions across the Pacific. So a keen interest of mine has been to ensure that the agency and voice of these institutions is heard, that we amplify what are often silent voices. So this is both a personal and preoccupation of mine, and something I'm quite passionate about, as Yeshe knows. So I'm really happy to be able to share some of these experiences with you, and some of the tools and approaches we've used to make that happen. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Peni. And thirdly, I'd like to introduce, give Gillian an opportunity to introduce herself.
You're muted, Gillian. Whoops, still muted. Let me just see if we have to unmute you.
Okay, how's that?
That's good. Thank you.
Good. My name is Gillian, and I live in Toronto, which are the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, also the Anishinaabe, and of them the Mississaugas of New Credit. And I was raised in Toronto, born in Toronto, and didn't know any of that growing up. So that's a big part of my identity. I identify as a white woman, I've worked a lot in grassroots in the 90s, and through then I started moving into organizations supporting a lot of grassroots partnerships, or partnerships between community and different service providers. So mostly in North America, not in international development contexts. And I think that for me, you know, I really learned about partnership from people who live in racialized bodies. And so a lot of the insights that they gained, you know, that they shared with me, you know, through those relationships and working together, informed my learning about partnership. And then very recently, through Mary Pickering, who's on today, I learned about Partnership Brokers Association. I had been teaching about partnership for about 10 years in different roles, and really clicked with the model. And so that's why I'm here today, and now developing more relationships with this community. So that's been really wonderful, and I won't say any more now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Gillian. So just one more person I'd like to highlight is Mary DeWitt, who is joining us from the US, who was also a part of the cohort. So with Yeshe and Gillian, and Mary DeWitt was a member, we also had PBA practitioners from New Zealand and others from Australia join us as well, and others from Canada. So we'll now go into the questions themselves. And again, this is something we will certainly be sharing with folks as a working draft that has been developed by the cohort. And the first area, we're not going to go through all of these questions in detail, but rather go by broad categories. So the first area is about exploring one's personal identity in relationship to race. And I'll turn it over to Yeshe first to highlight what stood out for you in terms of questions related to personal identity and relationship to race for you.
So look, I think the key thing for me is, and a lot of these questions relate to this, is the need to racialize myself in my brokering work, is the need to think really clearly about my whiteness, to identify as white, to use that word, to describe myself as a white woman, and to think really hard about what that means when I'm in a space. So that's been the main, you know, and actually the Robin DiAngelo book, White Fragility, is a bit, you know, my Bible in this space. And the key thing that I got out of that book was that I'd spent kind of 20 years working in the industry I do, international development, where white people have a radically disproportionate level of power and influence because of their race. I had been trying to identify myself as, I'm not one of those white people. You know, I'm not one of the bad white people. I'm one of the good white people. And Robin DiAngelo really educated me about how unhelpful that is, and how what you have to do is identify intensively with your own racial group, and talk about we, you know, we white people, and work on the responsibilities that you have as a white person, as a member of that affine. So that's what's been really important to me in terms of the brokering work and the training work, is racializing myself and making race explicit in most of the spaces that I work in, despite the fact that that makes me uncomfortable and a lot of the people in the space uncomfortable. It's productive discomfort. Yeah, so I think that's the key learning for me around the personal identity stuff, is working through that very complicated relationship that I have with being white, and working out how to sit within that in my brokering work.
Great, thank you, Yeshe.
White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. It's a great book.
Yes, and we'll be sharing, there's a set of resources that we'll be sharing as well. So thank you for that additional resource. And Peni, how about for yourself?
Thank you, David. You know, in looking at this, you know, this set of questions, I'm reminded of a discussion that Yeshe and I had when I underwent partnership brokering training, and you know, we raised this very question about race and about colonization, and how that's you know, in some ways suppressed the voice and the agency of Pacific Islanders. You know, it's because, you know, we were colonized by the British across most of the Pacific. I responded, I thought, quite strongly, and Yeshe and the other trainer, Kate, told us, actually, what you said barely made a dent in how white people felt. You didn't make them feel uncomfortable at all. So I guess one of my learnings, you know, from, you know, before that, but also since then, I've really worked on is, you know, how do we, as Indigenous people, or as Indigenous broker, how do I, you know, engage in robust conversations, or broker robust conversations, and do so calmly, but also in a way that will, you know, Yeshe talked about productive discomfort. You know, how do we get to a place where people are uncomfortable, but we're able to have productive discussions about race, and how, you know, changing the status quo will help push people forward in terms of their development. And so for me, it's been also about, you know, being oriented to a very strong sense of purpose about why we do the work that we do. Like Yeshe, I work in international development. And, you know, how do we bring out the concerns of Indigenous people in a way that's constructive and productive, but that helps white people engage with them as well? And how do we maintain discussions in that space? I mean, it's quite easy, I've seen, for people to deflect away from those conversations, from those robust and difficult conversations. But I think one of the skills as a broker is being able to, I guess, maintain the heat, you know, to keep that discussion, to facilitate the discussion in a way that maintains the heat, that keeps people engaged, while recognizing that it is a difficult conversation to have. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Penny. I really like that phrase that both of you highlighted, productive discomfort, and the fact that, a lot of partnership brokering is about creating something that wasn't acknowledged or didn't exist before. And so it's really moving into that space where there is no cookie cutter or no real known end outcome that's a for sure thing. Gillian, what about from your perspective?
Well, there's a lot of questions in this area, but certainly, I've been reflecting a lot on the different kinds of partnership spaces that I've worked in. And I find that when I'm more of an external broker, I'm often coming from an organization that is predominantly white or completely white. And so that's very different from earlier when I was more in community, and often those networks we had an anti-oppression statement. So we had a frame of reference was already there. So I was thinking about my whiteness and my privilege, like in relation to something that was already there. And now I find it's more about me trying to think about how do I bring this in? And you've talked about, the less comfortable space. And so that's effectively what I'm bringing in, right? I'm opening up and saying, oh, let's go into that less comfortable space over here where I'm talking about my whiteness with you. And actually the three of us are all white. So inviting people into that, and I think I've learned how to do that again from people of color, Indigenous people who've taught me humility. And so I think, David, you also spoke of that just now about the continuous learning. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Continuous learning. And, one of the things that stood out for me in terms of the PBA ethos is about the value of reflection. So the one thing that we'd want to highlight around this question set is it's presented from, if we look at standard left to right, but it's by no means meant to be purely sequential. So that said, I will move us to the second area of questions, which is around preparing ourselves for partnership work in relation to race. So moving from the personal now to the realm of the work that we do as partnership brokers. And Yeshe, if I could turn to you in terms of, a key question or thing that stood out for you in this area.
Yeah. So I guess the main issue for me around this is how do I gather resources? So, reading is obviously an important thing to do. I've chosen to speak intensively with people like Penny to try and check how I'm going to handle race within these environments, also with my colleagues. I have some really close partnership brokering colleagues that are my peers that I use as a sounding board. But yeah, the most useful thing is talking to people from the non-white groups that are going to be in the room, because I've made a decision that because the power differential is so great, usually in the rooms I'm in, my personal decision is to try and serve the racial groups that don't have as much power. That is tricky because it means sometimes I'm not extending the same amount of support or care to the white people in the room. And I do prioritize the outcomes and the needs of the Black and brown people in the room. Usually I try and do that. I cop some heat from the white people because of that though. So it's a decision that is a tricky one to take. So usually I try and prepare myself by talking as much as I can with the Black and brown people in the room. But then there's a real thing about, am I doing that thing about requiring the Black and brown people to help the poor white person with their learning journey, So I worry all the time about how much I'm requiring them to kind of stimulate and support my needs around being a white person in the room. So actually I find the personal preparation thing quite tricky, but absolutely necessary to have thought through who's going to be in the room, what the needs are around explicitly exploring race, and how to prepare myself for it. Sorry, I feel like that's a bit rambling, but I hope that's useful.
That's very useful. I'm hearing you highlighting a concept that is emphasized in the partnership brokers training around having a critical friend or a colleague that you can have these more exploratory, intimate conversations where it may not be possible to have them in the full partner forum. So thank you for that, Yeshe. How about for yourself, Peni?
Thanks, David. Yeah, no, so the regular reflections I find in preparation and preparing for brokering, I find the regular reflection with colleagues such as Yeshe really useful. But one tool I use quite often to help me really understand the different contexts we're working in. I mean, there's the Pacific population numbers in total about 10 million across 16 odd countries. Populations vary from a few 100,000 to 5 million or 6 million in Papua New Guinea. So I use an approach called political economy analysis to really understand where power lies and how it's used, what the incentives are for people to behave in certain ways, what their drivers are. My primary resource has been other Pacific Islanders, recognizing that the people from and of that context will have the best knowledge of the way things work. So it's really valuing and highlighting knowledge that comes, that is both indigenous and endogenous. It's both from and of the context. At the same time, it's also, it's also important for me as a broker to really acknowledge the role that colonization and the role that development white people have played in the Pacific, and to also understand that that's played a role that's both negative and positive, in us ending up where we are today. But I think what I really feel is important is that we have that really robust knowledge of the context and of the way systems and people and processes work, but also acknowledging that that we have to engage also with white people, including those we work with, and the organizations that we work for in productive ways. I think one of my ongoing challenges is that I'm an Indigenous broker working for an Australian funded organization. And so that brings its own implicit challenges with it. Where do I continue to work for what essentially, amplifying Indigenous agency and voice, and also representing the organization's professional interests? Again, doing that analysis, that political economy analysis, is really helpful. And I found that that's really helped inform the way that we work. It gives you so much evidence about what the different stakeholders are and what their incentives and drivers are, and then how you work through those to achieve the outcomes of the partnerships that you're brokering.
Thank you, Peni.
Can I add one thing? Sorry, I think the other really important thing for this is to understand really deeply that you can't possibly get this right. There's not going to be any forum where you're having explicit work on race where you're going to walk out of that forum and think, yeah, I got that right. Like there's always going to be an element of wrongness in it. And depending on yourself and how you work and your sense of kind of professional reward, I think it's really good to try and get that in your head, that this is just a space that's so fraught. So that's really important for me, to give myself that leeway and that grace to know that I'm going to do my best, but I'm definitely going to get it wrong almost every time. And to have those rigorous relationships. I love a conversation Peni and I had where he said, it's not that I dislike white people, I just dislike some of the things that they do.
Right.
And I need to have those conversations before I'm going into these spaces. It's really helpful. But yeah, you can't get it right. It's impossible.
I think this being about a learning journey, there's also the judgment calls you're making around, what is it that I need to learn for myself, and what is it that we can learn together, so that, it's my own ignorance isn't creating rifts unintentionally. But that's obviously a judgment call and something that gets learned through experience. I'm going to turn it over to Gillian in terms of, Gillian, your perspective in preparing for partnership work in relation to race.
Yeah, well, when you talk about learning, like I love tools, so it's always, what tools have worked well in the past, but also which ones do I have to go look for maybe? What's going to be the right one for the language and where a group is coming from. I was going to reflect also just I did do some work once. It was a one-off sort of one-day intervention, although we had an ongoing relationship with a project in another part of Canada, and it was a partnership between like an all like a Black community social worker organization and Women Against Violence organization that was the staff were all white anyways and the board members, so we were working with them, and they invited me to come in knowing that they wanted to like that there were dynamics of racial power and whatnot. This is in the east part of Canada that were at play. And so it's interesting because I have my go-to kind of structures as the triangle of oppression as a way to look at what's happening in terms of behaviors that are more visible, and then the ideas behind them and the systems, both policies and the ways of doing things, right, that are behind racism and people's experience of that. But in that instance, so they were welcoming me in to help them do this work. And by the way, I mean, interesting about who goes in and does this. I had a colleague at the time who's a Black woman, also based in Toronto, but she was on mat leave. So I was the one going to do this, the white woman. So I did do calls in advance, of course, with both partners to establish some relationship. But what I found was helpful. Is that we did do an activity first about about their stories, and we did drawing. As I was talking to someone earlier about, I use arts-based techniques. They did drawings of the milestones that brought them to working together, and it was fascinating how once they shared that, which was very much story sharing, which as I've learned is very much an Indigenous way of working, and very much builds relations. That they did that, and then when we brought out later the triangle of oppression, then they were mapping, and it became very clear how those experiences then could be mapped onto the ideas of who should lead a project, a partnership, the ideas of how a partnership should work, and the realities that the Black-led organization was completely underfunded and under-resourced generally, and also in the context of the partnership funding they had received. So I'm finding that just having a lot of variety of resources is helpful. And then I have ones that I like, but I'm always having to seek out and learn new ones because I'm always changing as well, who I'm working with and also the ways that I'm working. I have some resources, by the way, which I will put into the chat. They're just sort of my latest little list of top resources, kind of for a North American audience, and one of them's a novel, but it's a big novel, great. So watch out.
Well, and I think it's about different approaches, and it's about the perspectives, but also different approaches. I'm talking about how we get to know each other, and in some ways, I feel like I need to check myself for not becoming too rote in terms of here's the first 10 minutes being the icebreaker, and I've got one of two questions that I ask, and having different opportunities where can there be more story sharing, or something that's been more interesting for myself is this idea of introducing ourselves via our ancestry, even though that might not seem entirely relevant to the work at the face of it. There's some importance of getting to know people at a deeper level. So Gillian, really appreciate you broadening the perspective of how we get to know each other. Now there was a question, yes, to reinforce that we will be sharing these slides. So at the end of this, I want to turn us to this third set of questions around preparing oneself on specific conversations or sessions. And just as a prompt, we're hoping to have about 5 minutes or so at the end to answer maybe one or two questions. So If you have something that's come up, you can put that in the chat box, or we might turn to you when we open it up. But I'm going to turn back to Yeshe in terms of some specific preparations that come to mind.
Yeah, look, and all of us in our brokering work, we know that we have our personal style, and the really key kind of tenet of PBA is that there's an approach, but you have to adapt it to your personal style and the way that you work. I know that my style is pretty, culturally as well. I'm Australian. I've worked with a team of Canadians, and I was described by Canadians as brusque, which is something I've never been described as in Australia. But even for Australians, my style is pretty forthright, pretty in your face. I use a lot of humor, but it's quite challenging, whereas some of my colleagues are very nurturing and softer in the way that they do their brokering work. So when I do work on race, my instinct is to be pretty in your face. Also, I don't have much tolerance for white people who are being paid a huge amount of money to work in multiracial spaces, but aren't willing to spend time exploring the privilege that comes with their whiteness. So I have to work really hard on my approach and say, is that style going to serve the group, or is it going to shut them down and mean that they can't engage productively in a discussion? On this issue of race, do I need to radically adjust my style, my presentation, and the way I would do brokering? Or is it useful? Should I be pushing? Is that style what's needed for the white participants in the room, but is actually going to be bad for the black and brown participants in the room? So there's a lot of, so these questions I've put there about, will I tread softly? Will I deliberately use more challenging language? I know from experience that just using the term white people will cause a problem in the room. Just, if nothing else, just by using those words in a multiracial room, the white people will immediately become deeply uncomfortable, and some of them will become hostile as soon as I just use those words, without anything else. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of, you need to do a lot of personal preparation to think through your brokering and training style if you're training as well around these topics. And I'm curious, Penny, I don't want to shove you, but the point there about, will I choose to be a voice for those black and brown people? I know you added that question. I'd love to hear what you think about that particular point.
Yes, let's hear from Penny on that. Thank you, Yeshe.
Thank you. Thanks, David and Yeshe. I think part of the reason that's driven me to work quite passionately about amplifying the agency and voice of Indigenous people is having that lived experience, of experiencing racism. I grew up both in Fiji and Australia, and felt it keenly in Australia. I was there in my late teens, and coming back home. Over time, it's really crystallized the need to build equitable relationships, particularly professionally. So I guess my style is somewhat more restrained and I guess a little more formal. The Yeshe might call it stiff when I'm facilitating partnerships. But I find that one of the benefits of being a black or brown broker is that I feel that it's a responsibility, particularly around that question, to amplify the agency and voice of people who are unwilling to express certain ideas or certain sentiments in plenary. Quite often it's a result of having side conversations or doing the prep work that you find out certain things. So quite often I choose to drop into discussions, for example, some concerns, and frame it in a way that can be a little confronting for white people in the room, but is something they can sustain that heat, but that also allows the Indigenous people in the room to be able to agree to say, I agree with that, even though I didn't say it, bring that into the room, I do agree with that. And so increasingly, I'm finding myself, choosing to bring issues into the room that I think will help level the playing field. What helps is that, when we also talk about partnership brokering, which we use as an organization, internally within the organization, we talk about leveling the playing field, building equity. And we talk about the different ways that we do that in brokering and what that looks like. So I think it also helps the white people, or the Australians I work with, understand where I'm coming from when I choose to be a voice for people and willing or unable to express certain ideas in those plenary sessions.
Thank you, Peni. One of the things that strikes me is hearing from both Yeshe and Peni is the value in co-brokering and to attend to representation within a brokering team, as well as a diversity of styles. I mean, both of you talked about what your particular style is. I would like to, Gillian, I would like to turn to you just for your perspective on any things that come to mind, a thing that comes to mind around specific preparation, and then we'll open it up to questions with the remaining time that we've got.
Yeah, and I realize that we are short on time, so I'm going to go for the very last question, at least in a particular section that I was looking at, which says, what could happen if I don't make the time to co-initiate, prepare for, and facilitate such a dialogue? And so the time and also the courage, like if I ask myself that question, if I don't, you know, garnish the courage and make the time, I just remind myself that it's not just that nothing changes, but that harms continue. Because I think, you know, Peni, you shared about people sharing stories because, you know, they trust you and it's a safe place. And so I've had that so much experience, and so much of my learning comes from people sharing those stories. And so I feel like I need to be using my white privilege, right, to bring that out in a safe way for those people who might have shared. Or a lot of what I know also I learned from them, and it's taught me that, you know, the way things are going, and they might look really nice on the outside. I'm in Canada, remember Yeshe was commenting about our Canadian in overall some leanings of our dominant culture, that we need to be really careful when we know better, right? That when we know better, that things aren't okay. And so how do I use the access to privilege? Resources is huge. My access to resources, right? To be able to bring that to making changes or making space for the people who don't normally have that voice, to be able to amplify their voice, so that those changes can happen.
Thank you, Gillian. Yes, Yeshe.
I don't know, I think maybe it's on the next slide, but it's about the what can happen physically for brokers when these conversations kind of happen. I've been in multiple spaces now where I have introduced a discussion of race into a room, and the response has been so negative and overwhelming. I'm now very aware that what's going to happen in a room. I'm aware that I'm probably going to get a bit sweaty palmed and shaky in the stomach by the level of kind of anxiety and hostility that comes up in a room. I've had multiple experiences where I've had white people or one memorable Portuguese woman kind of banging a table and pointing at me saying, we didn't have a problem with this until you introduced this into the room. And at the same time, the kind of black and brown people giving me beseeching eyes saying, we did have a problem with this before. But I've had white people saying, you're unprofessional. I would never make the professional choices that you do. You're causing division within our team that wasn't here before you opened this conversation. So, and I've also had experiences like Peni talked about, him introducing topics in service of the black and brown people in the room. How's the dilemma for a white broker? We're supposed to represent all parties and partners within the room. What happens if the black and brown people are not speaking? We know what their issues are. They've talked to us about them confidentially in one-to-ones. What's my role as a white broker in representing those black and brown stories if they're not willing to bring them forward, you know? What's the representation issues there? I've been in a room with Peni where I was having a debate with other white people in the room about the race issues of black and brown people who were in the room silent. And imagine that moment of internal kind of, you know, things are coming out my mouth, and at the same time in my head, I'm saying, what kind of position am I in here? You know, help. So I think there's for me, you know, a lot of brokering work is quite, is physically felt because we are encouraging uncomfortable conversations and pushing people into difficult space. But the race stuff is on a whole different level. The level of hostility and anger that comes out of white people when they're forced to engage on the issue of race. And yet the need that you have to really physically prepare yourself for that, for what's going to come at you if you engage on that.
Yeshe, thanks for you sharing that. I will thank you as well. I think you're raising this, it can cause some internal conflict around our desire to serve, as well as understanding agency and ensuring that, I'm not representing where the voice is more appropriately coming from others in a room or in a partnership. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn to, we've had a question come through in the chat box, I see. And the question is from Kate asking, how would you encourage a white person who feels shame on behalf of their race to show humility and start the conversation? Challenging question for sure. Gillian, I see your hand up, and then we'll go to Yeshe.
Yeah, I love the use of humility because it's one of the 7 teachings of Anishinaabe and I think other Indigenous peoples near where I live. That when I first saw those 7 teachings, most of them matched what I had been raised with, but humility did not exist on the list that I was raised with. So yeah, the question, how would I encourage a white person who feels shame on behalf of their race? Well, I think I tend to share my personal experience. And so this is me now. I might not have said this or known this a couple of years ago, but I'm starting to situate myself better just like in relation to all the anti-racism work that needs to happen. So maybe I've been doing it, for more years than this person. Maybe I don't have the feelings of shame because it's so clear to me that I'm part of these structures and I was raised in these structures, and that if I'm not careful, I will reproduce them. But I think, yeah, the humility comes from that seeing ourselves into connection to everyone else. So it's humble me and what can I do in this moment in relation to the people and the partnership that I'm working with to take some action around anti-racism, even be talking about it, etc. So I don't know if I answered that in a helpful way. I feel like I do feel shame sometimes, but I don't very often because I think very structurally. And so I'm like, that was terrible. Like I caused harm, right? I caused harm because as a white woman, I carry all this privilege. And if I'm not careful, I'll just reproduce it and I will cause harm. So when somebody tells me that I've caused harm, if I can see the connection to the structural piece, it's easier for me to, take responsibility and then think about, okay, what do I have to change or go read about or learn or be open to or step back from so that I won't be reproducing that so often.
I think that is helpful, Gillian. It's like where do we fit within the system? So it's not, this weight is all on me. Like if I'm a partnership broker but it's also understanding I'm part of a context, part of a community of people or communities that maybe need to better align. So that is helpful.
Because yeah, I think it's that colonial school system that, I was raised in that taught me initially, you need to be an expert on this. And I'm still unlearning that yes. Actually making change and creating the world we want, I don't need any expertise. It's about, the relational work.
Thank you. And Yeshe, can I turn to you next?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. So for starters, the white people that experience shame aren't the problems, I think, in terms of humility. When you're working in the PBA community, you tend to assume that we're representative of the broader community, but the people who are attracted to PBA tend to be people who are willing to do much more work on this stuff. And it's shocking, actually, when you get out into the broader community, the number of white people that are just completely disinterested in engaging on their whiteness. So, that's where the humility problem comes in for me, is trying to just get white people to even engage on the fact that race is a dynamic within their partnerships. But there's two things for me that are really important with working with those, you know, white people that do experience shame or humility. One is, as I said at the start, is talking about we. So you can, you know, we white people. So you can kind of model an approach because you are a group, an affine group. We don't usually think of ourselves as a racialized grouping. We don't identify together as a race. And when you do that, and as a white broker, identify yourself as part of that group of white people, you can kind of model an engagement on this topic without shame. So that's been really important for me, not separating myself, as I said, from, you know, I'm a good white person versus I'm just part of this racial group and everything that we need to deal with. The other that's really important for me, which came out of the Robin DiAngelo book, is post-civil rights movement in the States and, you know, North America, which the impact spread all over the world. There was this sense that racism was about an individual choice that an individual makes. And of course, you know, if you do that, you're a bad person who's made bad choices. So of course, white people can't be racist, left-leaning liberal white people, because I wouldn't make such a bad choice as a person. So it's really useful, DiAngelo's approach to me that says, this isn't about individual choice, it's a structural issue. And if you were brought up and fed racism in your mother's milk, you know, I grew up in a segregated town where the Aboriginal population lived in a segregated area called the Mission in the middle of the town, and they still do. So it's completely segregated. I never had a teacher who was a person of colour. I never had a role model who was a person of colour. I never saw an image of beauty that was an image from a person of colour from my entire childhood into my early 20s. Of course I'm racist. That's not a personal individual choice. That's the society that I grew up in. That's how I was taught. My responsibility now is to deprogram myself. So I think if you can relieve people of that individual burden of shame and just acknowledge that you've grown up in a system that wasn't your choice, and you don't need to feel shame about that. What you need to do is deprogram yourself. You know, that I think that you can relieve people of that individual burden. Yeah. Shame feeling white person is not the problem. it's the non-shame feeling white person.
Thank you, Yeshe. And I think you raise a really important point about the possibility of us being in a bubble, being within the PBA community and really understanding there are perspectives broader that we need to be aware of. I want to give Peni a chance to add any final comment, and I'm seeing that we're just past the half hour, but Peni.
Thanks, David. I'll be quick. I guess for me as an Indigenous person, you know, one thing that I do encourage people, you know, white people to do is to, you know, you know, starting the conversation, I think is one thing, but it's also to be able to, you know, show me what you mean, you know, show me that you're committed to what you're saying. And so in partnership brokering, for me, I think it also means, you know, getting white people or you know, the organizations we work with to commit to certain things within the partnership. And I think that really shows Indigenous people or Black people that you know, you mean what you say, and that you are interested in leveling the playing field. You know, so for me, the priority when you sense that there's a recognition of inequity in the room is to say, how do we begin to level the playing field? How do we begin to give power to Indigenous organizations or to Black or brown people? Thank you.
Thank you, Peni. It's really about what we're doing that goes beyond a specific project. It's, you know, are we attending to things for the longer term around structure and systems? Thank you so much to Yeshe, Peni, and Gillian for sharing your experiences. It's been really valuable. I also want to thank Jocelyn for creating this wonderful platform through this community practice. Of course, all of you for taking time out of your day to join us. Just a final kind of question or comment would be, if you have an interest in taking this question set and applying it to your work, and then an interest of sharing how that has worked and helped you in your partnership brokering, we would love to hear from you. This is just an initial set, and we certainly would value any additional input that comes from your own direct experience. So I'll turn it over to Jocelyn for just final close.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, David, and to our guests, Gillian, Penny, and Yeshe. It was just so wonderful to have this opportunity to hear from you all. And just as a quick final comment, I will be sending out all of the resources, the slides. I've taped this so that people will be able to listen to it and hopefully be able to share it with some of your colleagues, or when you even have meetings, because I think it's just been such a rich conversation. I have you all on my mailing list, so we will be having another community of practice in June. We're just finalizing the details with another Australian who's going to be joining us, and I'll let you know as soon as that is finalized. But thank you so much again to everyone for taking the time to join us, and look forward to having this conversation continued, and perhaps a year from now we'll have a chance to come back and talk further about where we're at. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.